On behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta, I would like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, launch of the Mission 89 Global Thematic Report on Trafficking in Sport. And by the way, very honored to have you, honorable member of the National Assembly of Kenya. You just came in, and we are very happy to see you. Today, I would like to welcome and thank our expert speakers. Mrs. Lerina Bright, Executive Director and founder of Mission 89. And actually, you you did most of the work, I would say. And I'm very happy to have this new webinar with you. And you shall be our moderator. And our keynote speaker, Kevin Highland, OBE, LLM, former UK government's first independent anti-slavery commissioner for 2014 to 2018, and now chief executive of Preveni Global. Then we will listen to a personal testimony from Mr. John Michael Lander. He is an American survivor of child sexual abuse. He is a certified trainer and life coach for the Self-Talk Institute, Voice of the Voiceless, and founder of An Athlete's Silence. Then we'll have a first segment, Conceptual Framework, with Dr. Olawale Mayegum, former ambassador of Nigeria and former director of social affairs at the African Union, now an independent consultant. Then Dr. Monique Emser, senior lecturer and political science program coordinator at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And following that, we'll have a second segment, technical analysis and case studies with Dr. Katerina Schwartz, associate professor in anti-slavery law and policy in the School of Law, and she is also associate director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham in the UK. After that, we'll have a recommendation segment led by Dr. Olawale Mayegum, and then a panel discussion moderated by Kevin Highland with Marie-Laure Lemineur, head of Safeguarding and Child Protection Department at FIFA, and also the Honorable Jared Odoyo, member of the National Assembly of the Republic of Kenya. We are very happy to see you here. So we know that trafficking in human beings is unfortunately present in all areas. Its development in sport and around major sporting events remain largely unknown. It poses complex challenges that we will be discussing during this event with a panel of experts and a victim's testimony. Let me allow that the US Department of State, including trafficking in sports for the first time in their 2020 TIP, Trafficking in Person report, and estimated that, I quote, within Europe's soccer industry alone, there are 15,000 human trafficking each year, mainly from West Africa. Due to this lack of data, the scope of trafficking in sports is difficult to determine. Trafficking in sports is predominantly found in football, baseball, ice hockey, and basketball, but also in lesser research sports. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce you to the contents of the high quality global thematic report on trafficking in sport, recently produced under the auspices of Mission 89, the co-organizer of this event. I would like here to underline the exceptional value of the very important work of Mission 89 under the leadership of Lerina Bright. And now, Lerina, I would like to give you the floor, and you are now the moderator.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Voiti, for those thoughtful remarks. And also, I'd like to thank the Sovereign Order of Malta's commitment to combating human trafficking in all its forms. I'm also particularly thankful to yourself and to your team for what I would consider your sustained interest in this topic, and your continued and consistent support, which is very important, of Mission 89. And I'm glad that we're now united in partnership to fight against sport trafficking. So good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone you're in. I'm Larina Bright, and it's truly an honor to serve as the moderator today as we launch the 2024 Global Thematic Report on Sport Trafficking, which was a collaborative effort between Mission 89, Loughborough University, and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, UK. And, through this session, you will hear from presenters that actually worked on the report and worked on the preparation of the report. So as we begin, I think it's also really important that we take a moment to reflect on the gravity of the topic that we're discussing today. Sport trafficking, affects real people. I know that there's a fixation on numbers and how many people, data points, but we are talking about human beings, primarily young people, vulnerable individuals, and they're seeking opportunities through sport. So it's important to remember that, behind every statistic is a human story. And it's these stories that drive our work. So I'll begin my report or the overview that I will provide on the Global Thematic Report by stating that the sport industry is valued between 471 billion to 1.4 trillion annually. And it's become a target for traffickers who exploit vulnerable individuals, particularly young athletes from the global south. This exploitation remained hidden for way too long, partly due to the fact that human trafficking is a hidden crime, but also a lack of a clear definition for sport trafficking basically hindered effective legal and policy responses. So today we're collectively proud to present the Global Thematic Report on Sport Trafficking, which, as Ambassador Voithi mentioned earlier, it is truly a groundbreaking report. It introduces a scholarly and working definition of sport trafficking, which highlights the systemic recruitment and exploitation of individuals in sport through coercion, labor, abuse, and even sexual trafficking. The report's findings have been instrumental in distinguishing sport trafficking from other forms of human trafficking, and it aligns with Article 3 of the UN Trafficking Persons Protocol. This definition isn't just a technical achievement, it's also the foundation for future interventions, policies, and protections. Our work has gained significant momentum over the past years. For example, the UN Resolution 78-228, which was adopted following our 2023 General Assembly side event in New York, which, by the way, the result of was a call to action, a very powerful response to a call to action by Honorable Jared Okello, who's with us now. And following that powerful call to action, it was, this resolution was put forward, and it really, at that point, placed the topic firmly on the international agenda. This resolution recognizes the growing problem of sport trafficking and the international criminal networks behind it, calling for an evidence-based approach to ensure our policies protect all young athletes effectively. The Global Thematic Report we're launching today presents a typology of sport trafficking, supported by case studies to illustrate its various forms and impact. It calls for anti-trafficking laws aligned with the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol, protections for victims, and adjustments to immigration policies. Our work aligns with UN Sustainable Development Goals 8.7 and 16.2, aiming to end forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. Sport trafficking is indeed an emerging crucial aspect of SDG 8.7, and we're committed to tackling it as part of the broader goal to end child labor. So today's webinar is about translating these findings into action, from policymakers to sport organizations, from academics to athletes. We have a unique opportunity to forge a path forward that will protect vulnerable athletes worldwide. Our recommendations include training stakeholders to recognize and respond to sport trafficking, improving data collection to better understand the scope of the problem, adopting labor rights standards that protect athletes, and developing preventative solutions that build strong, resilient systems that are capable of safeguarding athletes from exploitation. As we proceed with today's presentation and discussions, I invite you all to reflect on how we can collectively implement these recommendations. Our partnerships with governments, international organizations, and key stakeholders is essential in scaling these responses. And so at this point in time, I would like to, if Mr. John Michael Lander is with us, I would very much like to introduce him, and so that he can share his perspective and also his personal experience.
Hello, hello. Are you there? Can you hear me? Thank you. Hi, I just want to thank everyone, Michelle and Lorena, and everyone who has made this opportunity a possibility for me to be here. So thank you so much. I am John Michael Lander, and as you see first, you might think of me as a privileged white male from the United States. Appearances can be misleading. As a 14-year-old Olympic-bound athlete, the adults responsible for my training exploited and sex trafficked me throughout my 4 years of high school, while I represented the U.S. in international competitions for springboard and platform diving. During this time, influenced by my appearance, my background, my family, and the identity of those who exploited me, not a single person expressed concern about or questioned the situation. I was not recognized as a trafficking victim because I was presented an opportunity to improve my life, to go for the Olympics, and to go for a college scholarship. I did not fit the ideal sex trafficking victim. 1, I was male. 2, I'm not a runaway. 3, I was not from a broken family. 4, my family was not from a lower economic situation. 5, I was not abducted. 6, I never thought I was vulnerable. And 7, I was presented an opportunity. Let me just say that again, an opportunity. I was a determined child and committed to succeeding in everything that I did. I was popular, an A student, and respectful to my adults. I debated equality for everyone as a middle school student. I won awards for speaking as a high school student. I was on the honor roll, the National Honor Society, top of my class, and president of the yearbook. Coming from a rural farming community, such things as sex trafficking were thought to be impossible because everyone seemed to know everyone else and their business. No one wanted to acknowledge that I may have been exploited, let alone trafficked. I was a hometown hero at the age of 14. What I like to call as my CEO traffickers were professionals earning significant incomes: lawyers, judges, police officers, doctors, therapists, professors, business owners, frontline professionals, etc. They work together as a unit, protecting each other in the process I like to call the predatory grooming trifecta, which we've seen this happen with the U.S. Gymnastics, Ohio State University, Michigan State University, University of Michigan, Penn State University, Boy Scouts of America, religious groups, and so on and so on and so on. Where in this predatory grooming trifecta, the predators groom the institution or the organization first, then the parents or the guardians second, and then the child, which can help the predator go undetected for years. My story is unique because it belongs to me. It is different because it doesn't conform to the narrative that our government officials, researchers, and frontline professionals project about sex trafficking. Yet, my story is more common than you may think, and it is occurring right now in our own communities and backyards. Think for a moment. If the stat 1 in 4 females and 1 in 6 males are sexually abused before the age of 18 is true, then let's look at the Paris Olympics just happened. How many athletes were there in attendance? And how many of them are sexual abuse survivors silently hiding? So when I was 14, I took 8th at the Junior Olympics and represented the United States for the next 4 years. And my whole goal was going to the Olympic Games. This immense pressure and sacrifice of competing at this level fostered an environment filled with secrets. The dynamics between athletes, coaches, and medical examiners became intense and manipulative. As I was still growing mentally, emotionally, and physically, I became the perfect prey to a predator's desires and the ideal target for being groomed into a reality of silence, shame, and denial. So, just give a little example about what happened with me. As a 14-year-old, I took 8th at the Junior Olympics, and I gained some attention through the newspapers and the media. And what happened is that a lawyer saw this article and reached out to my parents. What we did not know at the time is that he had already reached out to my team and the board members of our team and set up a situation where they wanted to sponsor certain athletes, provide scholarships, pay for equipment, pay for travel, all of this. And if they could do that, then they would like to move forward and become sponsors of our team. They also wanted to present our team with a new diving coach, which would help the team move forward in nationals and international competitions. So all this happened first before this lawyer ever met my mother. He met my mother for a couple months, and they would go on coffee dates or dinners, and they would talk. And he basically groomed her into believing that the only way that I could go to the Olympics was through this group of professional people. She believed him. She signed a contract. Once he had the contract with my mother, she basically handed me over to him, and he started to groom me. He basically told me that the only way I could get to the Olympics was through this organization, and that he has this group of people who are professionals. They're willing to help us, and they're willing to give their expertise back to the family, which was very interesting because at the time my sister had a sledding accident and had to reconstruct her chin. And they provided all of the surgeries and everything needed without charging my parents. So I thought, oh, I'm helping my family, and this is an opportunity. This is how they presented the opportunity to me. You want to go to the Olympics, you want a college scholarship, we are the venue to go. And if you don't go, you're never going to make it because the odds of becoming an Olympian is like 500,000 to 1 in the US. So they were going to provide me every opportunity. There were 3 things that they wanted me to make sure that I did. 1 is that I did as well as I could in school, keep my grades up. 2, do as much as I can to be the best in my sporting event as possible and in competitions. And 3, not to upset the professionals. I thought this was an opportunity. I thought I was helping my parents. So I signed a contract. So if you look at how this works, this predatory grooming trifecta is that they focused on the organization first, which we saw with U.S. Gymnastics, which we saw with the Boy Scouts of America. And they provided a security for themselves within this organization because the organization is not going to want to lose their branding or lose their financial support or their income. So they're going to do everything to support this person. Then and only then did they start asking questions about me, in my case, or certain athletes. They will get as much information about them as they can. What kind of family are they from? What are they looking to do? Blah, 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 blah. And then they placed our coach in this situation, and he became relevant in this whole process because he started talking to me. He started pulling me aside. He started to isolate me from my teammates. He basically told me that they don't understand and they are jealous of me because I'm representing the United States at such a young age, and they haven't made that level yet. And so what had started happening is he groomed me into believing that he was the only one I could talk to. In competitions, he would start putting his hands on me in front of everyone. And I just assumed that this was part of being normalized. This is part of the sport. And this is what was going to have to happen if I wanted to move forward. And through these 4 years, I rose very quickly in the U.S. diving community. And I went to the Norway Cup, the Danish Cup, the Canadian Cup, and was representing all this. But at the same time, I was hiding a very dark secret. And that secret was that I was being passed around by these professionals. And once everything was in line, these professionals would have parties at a mansion in Columbus, Ohio. And we would go, there would be about 4 or 5 of us athletes, and we would go and we were put in certain outfits that were kind of revealing, and we would be lined up, and the guest, other professionals, would come in and they could ask questions from us. They could poke us, they could touch us, whatever they wanted to do. And then what they did is they went into a back room and placed a silent bid on which boy they wanted for the evening or the weekend or the week. And so the boy who got the highest would become that person's, whatever you want to say, the toy, however you want to look at it. And if the boy who had the highest bid would get special things like money or tuitions paid for, other things that could happen. And this is just how this all worked. And so there were many times that I was left with a good doctor who was part of the university, who was trying to get me in there to go to school there so I could be part of this program all the way through my university career, sorry. And so it was all very manipulative and organized, and it's on a very high level. All of these professionals were making at least 6 figures. They all were protecting each other. One of the boys wrecked a Mercedes that they were given to drive and had some marijuana on the seat beside him. So, of course, it went to court. Well, the lawyer became his lawyer. They go to court. Everything was settled outside of court as long as this group of professionals provided money to the court. Everything was erased. No one even knew about it anymore. So this is how this whole process works, and this is how we have seen it done. This is still happening. This is happening in elite sports. We've seen this in soccer. We've seen this in basketball. We've seen this in hockey. And what's really interesting is it's being focused on males because males are reluctant to report. We're constantly told that this is our only chance. There are 5 other athletes right behind us that could take our place. And really, you can't sexually abuse a male. We're still being told this today. And athletes are also told that there is no sexual abuse. It's really just a hazing, an initiation, or a rite of passage. We see that also in our fraternities. And it's one of these things that we believe that if we report, then we are weak. And we should have fought back. Why didn't you fight back? They don't take in consideration of how debilitating being sexually abused is at that moment. And being a 14-year-old, I was taught to respect my elders. So when the professionals are elders, so I followed through because I thought I was doing the right thing. We're also normalized. In sports, we're told what to think, how to think, and where to think. And then we're dropped if we don't fulfill what they want us to fulfill. We've seen this in the U.S. gymnastics where a gymnast has placed at the Olympic trials in the top 3 and doesn't get to go to the Olympic Games because she said something about Dr. Nasser. She was replaced by a person who finished 7th. This is what we are afraid of, and we're constantly in fear of our careers, our opportunities to get sponsorships, our opportunities to help our families. So when someone asks me a lot of times, well, didn't you know that this was wrong? There was a part of me that did know what was wrong, I think, but I also thought I was helping my family. I was helping everybody else, and I put those people ahead of me. And I thought that if this is all I had to do to become an Olympian, it was a small price to pay. And that's how I think a lot of us figure that we can get through this. And so it's one of those things that it's not just something bad. It's not so easy as black and white. I was talking to a woman, a friend of mine, who was abducted in France as a model and trafficked. She was with a friend who didn't want to do anything. I mean, she just had no ambitions or anything. And so we started talking about we never saw ourselves as vulnerable. And there's a lot of us who feel when everyone says, oh, the vulnerable athlete or the vulnerable person, we never saw ourselves as that. We saw ourselves as go-getters. We were representing our country. I didn't need the professionals to help me represent my country. I took 8th. I was on my way. It may have taken longer, but I was on my way. So this word vulnerable is something that really kind of is hard for me to understand because it didn't fit me. So when I hear everyone talk about all the vulnerable people, the vulnerable this, maybe in hindsight, I was vulnerable, but at the time I didn't see that. And so I felt like I never fit in. I wasn't vulnerable. I wasn't being taken. I wasn't abducted. Was I taken across state lines? Yes. Was I going to major sporting events and being auctioned off to other people that were there? Yes. But that just seemed to be part of what this agreement was, this opportunity. And so I just tried to do the best that I could. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands that this is happening on a very high level. We just saw down in Miami the Alexander brothers, who was with real estate, who have been trafficking women for years, and no one came up to them until these women started to get together and speak up. And thank God they did, or else these guys would still be going. We saw this with Weinstein. We've seen this with Kevin Spacey. We've seen this with people who are in the public eye, and no one wants to believe that they are doing something bad, but they are. And they're getting away with it because people are willing to support them. So that's basically my story. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer anything. So thank you for letting me have this opportunity to share my side.
Michael, for that powerful testimony and for reminding us all why the work that we're doing is so vital. I think part of the your experience just shows us that this form of exploitation isn't limited to one socioeconomic group. We always speak about a majority of the victims coming from the global south, but clearly your story shows that even in the global north, athletes are also affected. And I think an area that we need to look at more closely is obviously the recruitment process and the grooming process within that, because that could very well help us in terms of prevention and protection mechanisms as well, and of course awareness raising. So thank you so much. Kevin, if you would like to move forward and give the keynote address. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorena, and thank you for the invite to take part in this event organised by Mission 89 and the Sovereign Order of Malta. And I think that having heard, and I've heard John Michael speak before, but having heard it again, it has no less impact the second time from the first time. I think what John Michael does is actually reminds us of how serious this crime is. And so over the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to reflect on the crime, but particularly on some factors. The reports produced, the Global Thematic Report, I think is outstanding. And it defines what human trafficking in sport is. And what it's done, it's very cleverly encompassed that definition into other international and domestic legislation so that we can understand it in the context of sport. And then it spells out the three ways that it happens within sport. It can be in sport, it can be through sport, and it can be around sport. And if we look at sport, the National Football League Super Bowl generates 1.3 billion in the US economy, and 150 million of that is profit to the local economy who host the game. The World Cup, it's estimated between the whole areas of its existence, generate up to 1.4 trillion across the world globally. And of course, this money is money for good. And then when we look at the Olympics, similar kinds of monies are generated. And of course, sport is something for good. Sport has lifted so many people out of poverty. It's lifted people out of exploitation. It's lifted people given opportunity. So that's why it has perhaps a compelling duty to make sure that things like happened to John Michael do not happen. Because that's when it is allowing its goodness, its ability to identify ability, to nurture ability. And sport isn't about always being the best, it's about being your best. I see it in Ireland where I live, where women's sport is now starting to equal men's sport in many areas. Attendances, fees for winning cups, etc. So we really need to protect this such valuable commodity and asset and ability that is within the framework of community at local level, from kicking a ball, throwing a ball, chasing around, those kind of day-to-day sports that happen in local communities, local schools, right up to the FIFA World Cup, the Olympics, the NFL, right up to that level, Formula One. We need to make sure that this is an area that we're not going to allow criminals to actually infiltrate and make money. And I think one of the things that really jumped out on the report was the actual fact that there were 6 recommendations under 7 headings that were all manageable. But one of the ones that jumped out to me was the requirement on sports organisations themselves to build frameworks and capacity building. And I think I've seen that. When I was a police officer in London, I headed up the anti-trafficking work on the 2012 Olympics. And because of the duties that were imposed by the London Mayor's Office and by the government and LOCOG and others, which is the London Olympic groups, there were processes and procedures from the building to the events, to the actual events around the selling of goods, because that could attract forced labour, and also then women who are going to be exploited, who may be called in because there's going to be a greater population in the city, and people who may be exploited. But looking back on it, I think one area that perhaps was missing, which I wouldn't have had access to, was the village itself, the internal parts of the Olympics, because they are so well protected, because of the competition element, because of looking after the athletes. So that's something that the sports industry can specifically work on. But we know globally there are over 50 million people who are trafficked annually, generating in the region of 240 billion US dollars. And that money isn't floating around. It's money that can be identified. It's money that people are making out of people that they're attracting into sport. And sometimes it's outwith of what perhaps the industry can do itself, because when I was in southern Italy and I met young boys who were coming from Nigeria and Ghana, who were coming on the promise that they were going to play for the world's or Europe's best football teams in the top leagues. But they had an agreement that they would meet somebody in Rome, and when they got there, they would be taken to these teams. Well, that was never going to happen. They were going to end up in a life of exploitation. And of course, that isn't down to the football world itself. But the football world has got the ability to counter these activities, to send information out, to use their networks. Because when I was in Nigeria, I saw some of the wonderful work being done by the Premier League from the UK and other leagues to actually go in and build communities at grassroots levels, giving them footballs, giving them pitches, teaching them the rules. So they have got an enormous opportunity to prevent. And I think one of the things that this Mission 89 report does, and this particular work on combating trafficking, it really focuses on an area which is about identifying people's ability, about getting the best from people, about people putting people into opportunities that perhaps they may never had. But what we need to make sure is that that good work isn't used by criminals to do something that is to the most detriment of people. And I think that the sporting industry, because it is about achievement, because it is about finding solutions or doing the best, could be a leader in examples on how to combat human trafficking within their area and within their remit. So I just want to go back, thank Lorena for all that she does, the way that she has profiled this agenda, and she's not given up. I know she's had challenges in the past, but she's kept going. She's now got this onto the UN agenda. She's now got, for example, the safeguarding of FIFA joining us. So very senior people who are listening to you, Lorena, and I'm sure we'll be taking your words very seriously reading your report, and I commend you because I do think what you are doing and what you've done will make a difference for many people. And let's hope that the sporting world, that these people, and some of them will have talent, like John Michael, that they are looked upon and given the opportunities and protected, as opposed to being exploited for the very special talent they bring to this world. So thank you very much, Lorena.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for that insightful keynote address, and particularly also about the point that you made with respect to exploitation within the Olympic Village and other mega sporting events. I think that's very compelling and deserves our focused attention. This forum that we have now created gives us an opportunity to shape future research. There were definitely gaps we couldn't cover every aspect of sport trafficking. This report is the first edition, and we aspire to look into other areas, and so we'll most definitely be looking at mega sporting events in general, and the exploitation that is involved during the villages. Now, if I may move on to Ambassador Olawale Mayegun, former ambassador of Nigeria and the Director for Social Affairs at the African Union. As I mentioned before, he will be discussing the international legal framework, as well as some of the policy considerations related to this piece of work.
Thank you very much, Lorena, and let me thank Michelle, Kevin, and John Michael. I feel for you, and I can understand what you've gone through, because I've had the opportunity of working also at the community level with similar people. And thank you for coming up with your story and your preparedness to tell your story. Thank you very much for that. It inspires us to do more. Well, I'm going to be having this segment together with Dr. Monique Hensa, who is joining us from Durban, South Africa, and who is a co-author of this also report, a major contributor to the report. So I'm going to be very quick. We're looking at sports trafficking as an urgent problem, and the contribution so far has reflected that urgency. And so I'll say that it's a universal language. I may speak so many languages, but the language of sports, whether it's in football or in swimming, the aim is to win, and that language is understood. For many young athletes participating from the global south, sports represent hope, opportunity, and a better future. And we've had that today from Lorena and from those who have spoken earlier. Yet the same sports industry that generated the billions, the hundreds of billions we've had about, I wish I could know the exact figures, because it's keep changing every year. The billions of dollars that is generated also is a fertile ground for criminal elements. And as Kevin mentioned, I think we can do better. We can follow the money. We can follow we can make use of other instruments of money laundering, of so many of those things. We see some of those things happening even in broad daylight. So we can still do a lot. And the trafficking of young athletes, especially minors from the global south, is also a growing crisis, as our report shows. Now, sports trafficking remains largely invisible, and unlike other forms of trafficking, which are recognized and tackled within the global framework, sports trafficking remains an under-researched and poorly understood phenomenon. It's not surprising, as I always love to say, when the relevant instruments were being negotiated way back in 1998 to 2000, no one was thinking about sports trafficking. And so the manifestation of the crime takes advantage of the ambitions of young athletes, exploiting their dreams through deception, coercion, and sometimes violence, as we've witnessed in the case of football. In the case of baseball and some others. What makes sports trafficking distinct is highly deceptive context in which it operates. Criminal actors exploit the professional ambitions of young athletes and global demands for talents in ways that they are hidden from the public view. Sports trafficking is deeply embedded in the sports ecosystem and mechanisms of sports recruitment, development, and competition. But not just that. So why then do we embark on this study? There are two. The rationale. There are two related rationale for us to. The first rationale is the need for definition, and it's related to the second one, which is paucity of data. Like other contemporary forms of exploitation, sports trafficking has never been legally defined nor recognized. The extent to which it falls within the prohibition of trafficking in person as defined in the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol remains somewhat ambiguous. Again, I refer to my earlier statement. No one ever had sports trafficking in mind when we were looking for that fine piece of international legislation that defined trafficking in Article 3A of the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And that no precise definition that captures the unique conditions and vulnerabilities within the sports environment or ecosystem. This is a challenge which translates into application of domestic anti-trafficking laws. The exploitative nature of sports trafficking is not always apparent, and in some cases may be seen to fall outside the scope of the definition of human trafficking. The absence of a clear legal definition or comprehensive guidance on the application of trafficking laws to cases of sports trafficking leaves law enforcement and the judiciary in an ambiguous interpretative space. I'm sure Kevin will be able to relate to what I'm saying here. Interpretative state resulting in poor application of anti-trafficking laws in cases of sports trafficking. So that's number one. The other, and this leads to the second one, the paucity of data. If we cannot even identify something as trafficking, if it falls within that space, then we're not likely going to have data on it. So the necessity of carving out a specific definition for sports trafficking underpins the report, the global report, given the potential scale of the crime, the violation of the human rights of athletes, and the sheer numbers of related individuals who remain at risk of becoming victims. Often, exploitative practices occur at the initial stages of athletic recruitment, far from the gaze of the mainstream sports industry, making these abuses harder to detect and address. This global report emphasizes that without recognizing and understanding the full scope of these activities, many victims will remain invisible and unsupported. But then, the current lack of specific sports trafficking definition has led to significant gap in victims' identification and support. And there is a paucity of data on trafficking in sports, not surprisingly, as most cases, like I said, go unreported. And this is where the UN resolution referred to earlier by Larina comes in. That's resolution 7828 that really tackled this. And these are the two reasons that prompted us. I will invite, and of course, if I also mention that that we recall that the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children stated that the sale of child athletes for competitive training and ultimately profit amounts to a form of sale of children for forced labor. That's often very quite quickly apparent when it comes to, say, football, where we often ask the question, does the international transfer of minors amount to trafficking? Of course, we know FIFA has come up to do a lot of work. The question that we will be asking ourselves is whether the criminals are not, many steps ahead of FIFA and how well those things are working. This weekend, I'm glad that we have Marilla with us, and she will probably tell us more on what FIFA has been doing. But we know that a lot of trafficking of young minors still takes place through the football academies around the globe. At this point, let me pass on the mic or the space to Dr. Monique, who will now give us the conceptualization and how we dealt with these two related issues of data as well as the need for definition. Dr. Monique, vous avez la parole.
Thank you so much. So before I speak towards the conceptualization of sport trafficking, I think it's quite important that we just speak to a little bit about the research methodology that we employed in this report. And essentially, we followed a sequential explanatory design, integrating fieldwork that provides empirical evidence of how sport trafficking operates in practice. And I think that's very, very important for us. And we really used what we did when I said this in terms of a mixed method approach. We derived data from desktop research, surveys, key informant focus groups, interviews with stakeholders in sport, law enforcement, and the anti-trafficking community. And really from there, it helped us really build a report that was also premised around case studies, which were based on real-world examples of sport trafficking. And these case studies in turn illustrate the complexities of trafficking in different regions and contexts, which all contributed to the development of a typology of sport trafficking that Katerina will speak to in her segment, as well as a working definition of sport trafficking aligned with the UN TIP protocol, and really at the end of the day, how we actually need to understand the problem itself. And what makes the report so compelling is that it addresses gaps in the existing literature on sport trafficking by providing an evidence-based overview of the problem, and also it captures perspectives on the efficacy of measures by governments and sports stakeholders in tackling sport trafficking. And this is, we've seen when we were actually undertaking this research, is extremely under-researched aspect when we even talk about sport trafficking. And what became so apparent is that there's many layers and many complexities that we still need to explore within this particular field as well. But to start us off, I think it becomes quite relevant is how do we define it? What is a working definition of sport trafficking when we're talking about it before looking at the various concepts? We all know the UN trafficking protocol itself, and based on our research, we developed a working definition which is aligned to it. And as such, when we speak to sport trafficking, it is essentially the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving an individual, typically an athlete or an aspiring athlete, within or across borders through coercive, deceptive, or other abusive means for the purpose of exploitation in, through, or around sport. And exploitation may manifest as forced labor, sexual exploitation, slavery, servitude within sport-related activities or events. And as we all know, in the case of children, no means need to be present. So from that working definition, we need to start unpacking it. And I'll speak briefly in terms of how we conceptualize sport trafficking. And I know Katerina will speak more to it in more detail and flesh it out with the typologies and with the case studies. But there are three subsets, three distinct forms of sports trafficking that we identified. And I'll speak with broad brushstrokes to each. Firstly, trafficking in sport. And just to prime you on this, essentially when we're talking about trafficking in sport, it's exploitation within the sport ecosystem, within the sport industry itself. Secondly, trafficking through sport, where sport is used as a lure for exploitation elsewhere. And the third subset, trafficking around sport, which is exploitation linked to sporting events. So now when we speak about trafficking in sport, it becomes quite important to note that we're really talking about what is happening within the sports industry itself, the direct exploitation of athletes. And what we see in this particular subset is that in many instances, young athletes are recruited, often with false promises of professional contracts and training opportunities. We see this time and time again, particularly within the case of football, where many cases have been reported. And they are often subjected to exploitative contracts, forced labor, or debt bondage, with sports linked to football, basketball, baseball, martial arts, or athletics, for example. And what defines this as well is that the exploitation happens within the very structure of sports, and it turns athletes into commodities. And we really need to see in terms of how that is often a very hidden form of trafficking, particularly as we've seen with the powerful testimony that we had earlier of John Michael as well, that it really goes often unnoticed when we see different forms of exploitation taking place, not just in terms of forced labor, but also in terms of some cases of sexual exploitation as well. The next subset that we speak to within the report and conceptualizing that is trafficking through sport. And this is a very interesting area as well, because trafficking through sport refers to situations where sport is actually used as a deceptive tool to lure victims into other forms of trafficking. And it's also perhaps one of the most insidious types of sport trafficking, because it plays directly into the hopes and dreams of aspiring athletes, often leaving them vulnerable to various forms of exploitation beyond sport itself. And traffickers deceive young athletes with promises of trials or scholarships only to exploit them for forced labor, sexual exploitation, or even criminal activities outside of sport. And in transnational cases, we also see is that once lured into foreign countries, athletes often find themselves in precarious situations, far from any sport themselves. And this also then renders them far more vulnerable to other forms of abuse and exploitation. What's also very interesting about this particular type of trafficking, this particular subset, is that there are various levels of organization and sophistication which exist. And this is where we start seeing more organized networks, which may have links to organized crime and also migrant smugglers where transnational trafficking occurs. So when we see this also in this particular subset, it actually manifests in two ways. And again, it highlights just the complexities when we start talking about these different forms of sport trafficking, because exploitation can typically manifest in one of two ways. Athletes are primarily exploited financially by traffickers, whether they're predatory actors such as agents or those posing as agents, or even academies, and who abandon their victims once they've drained them of their resources. Or the second pathway, where athletes are trafficked for labor or sexual exploitation to industries unrelated to sport, sports criminality, and even in rare circumstances, organ trafficking. The third subset that we look at is trafficking around sport. And trafficking around sport addresses exploitation that takes place on the fringes of the sports industry, but is no less destructive. And this can include forced labor in the construction of sporting venues, such as stadiums for the FIFA World Cup, or in the manufacturing, service, or hospitality industries. And in some cases as well, traffickers use the draw of major sporting events to facilitate sexual exploitation. And as we've seen from the previous speakers, we need to actually start looking a lot more at what's going on within those particular mega events as well, to fully understand what may also be happening around these fringes. So that brings us to how we conceptualize this whole issue and what is based in terms of the findings of the fieldwork that we conducted. And what is quite striking is that we often see is that the exploitation of minors is really at the center of many of these issues that we're looking at. I know we've spoken about already the statistic of 15,000 children who are trafficked from West Africa to Europe every year in terms of football alone, and false pretenses of professional careers has already been cited. And we see in terms of other cases as well, it's really preying on youth and their aspirations in terms of competing professionally, but also in terms of those key grooming processes of themselves and their families as well, that often take quite insidious turns. Now, what's interesting as well from the fieldwork we conducted, from the interviews and the surveys, is that in many instances, quite particularly when we look at the case of football, for example, we need to be aware is that organized crime networks actually can play quite a significant role in trafficking, in sport trafficking itself. And we see is that these groups tend to exploit legal loopholes, unregulated sports academies, and fake recruitment agents to profit from the trafficking of athletes. And organized crime groups actually use sport as one of many avenues for trafficking people. In some cases, these networks are linked to other forms of trafficking, such as labor exploitation and industries connected to sport through trafficking through sport, like construction or hospitality around mega sporting events, but also for sexual exploitation in all three subsets of sport trafficking as well. So we need to also start looking in terms of breaking down how are these networks actually linked together? How do they feed into the various aspects of sporting organizations as well? And really look in terms of how we can navigate this and disrupt these particular groups as well. What we also find as well, that's also really been discussed, is also that there are gaps in regulation and oversight that these actors take advantage of. And we need to see that this was a recurring theme in our fieldwork, is that really it's the failure. There may be existing regulatory frameworks, but they are often gaps. There are loopholes that are exploited that then fail to protect athletes when we look across the board at all the different sporting types. And this is one of the things that we need to be aware of. Despite the presence of regulations from governing bodies, enforcement remains unfortunately weak. We're not detecting the victims that we should. And it's often many years later that pass that we actually hear that their stories of their abuse and their exploitation. But one of the key issues within the sporting community is that all too often unlicensed agents continue to exploit athletes, and also the key issue of sport academies. Some even set up as sham sport academies, and this is where we often see organized crime linking in, who operate without sufficient oversight. And this lack of transparency and accountability in the recruitment process leaves athletes vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. And it's these very gaps that create these enabling environments for traffickers to thrive. And also another point that keeps on being repeated and repeated wherever we looked and with whomever we spoke to was the lack of data and also, of course, awareness. I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks for us is the lack of awareness as well. Because Where we have a lack of data, the biggest problem is when we're talking about policy is always, well, where are the numbers? The biggest issue in terms of sport trafficking is that many of these cases go unreported and the issue remains poorly understood, well, within both the sports and the anti-trafficking community. So if we don't know what we're looking for and we don't know how to identify it, it becomes really difficult for us then to actively intervene and create those strategies that we need. And it's this paucity of data as well that limits our ability to effectively combat the problem. So from there we see is that these stakeholder responses really confirmed several critical issues for us. And one of the first that we saw is the perception of risk. Because many stakeholders reported that sport trafficking remains an under-recognized form of human trafficking, and there is a lack of awareness, like I've mentioned, among practitioners themselves about how trafficking operates in sport environments, which hinders efforts to identify and assist victims. So while law enforcement was familiar with trafficking persons for labor and sexual exploitation, for example, they really considered that athletes might also be vulnerable to those forms of abuse. They may encounter young athletes who appear to have been recruited under normal circumstances, but who were later found to be working under exploitative conditions. However, by the time those conditions became apparent, the traffickers had moved on, leaving the athletes in vulnerable situations without legal or financial protection. And in some transnational cases, there may also be an intersection at times with migrant smuggling, as traffickers make use of well-established smuggling routes and networks to move athletes across borders, further muddying the water and complicating victim identification. And in many cases, where athletes are being trafficked within sport, they're following all the regulatory routes. It is not apparent at all in terms of the abuse and exploitation that is taking place. So from there, we also saw is that, of course, then there's these key challenges then, like I've mentioned, in victim identification. And the biggest stumbling block is that when trying to identify victims of sport trafficking, the challenge exists because of the legitimate appearance of the sports industry. We don't really look beneath the surface. And as a result of this, sport organizations often fail to see the connection between trafficking and seemingly legitimate sports recruitment processes, which allows traffickers to exploit athletes more easily. And in addition, unlicensed agents and fraudulent recruitment schemes are very difficult to track as they operate outside the official structures of professional sport. So they're really falling through the cracks. And this in turn then makes it easier for traffickers to avoid detection and for athletes to slip through the cracks themselves. And finally, we saw in terms of our findings is that there are calls for enhanced cooperation. And this is so important with whatever type of trafficking that we're looking at, but particularly within sport trafficking. Stakeholders expressed a strong need for better cooperation between governments, sport organizations, and international bodies like the UNODC and Interpol. And this collaboration is essential for us to understand the evolving modus operandi of traffickers and trafficking networks in order to disrupt them, and most importantly, identify at-risk athletes before they fall victim to exploitation. So those were essentially the findings that we had from the field work, and in the next part we'll be moving on to the case studies and the typology. Thank you.
For our research findings and also for highlighting the critical and global dimensions of sports trafficking. Thank you also, Ambassador Mayagun, for those valuable insights on the legal and policy frameworks that are necessary to combat this form of trafficking, and also for answering the why this report is important and why a definition was needed. In the interest of time, I think we can move directly to Dr. Schwartz's presentation.
Thank you, Lorena, and thanks to all the speakers and the organisers for being here with us today and for organising this fantastic session, and to the fabulous feat that is this report. I'll try and keep my contribution relatively focused to retain time for discussion, but I wanted to ground the opening in this session in a recognition that trafficking is found where we look for it. At the moment, the scale of the problem of trafficking in persons broadly, not just in the context of sports, far outstrips the scale of our identification efforts. For every trafficking victim and survivor that is identified, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that are never identified and never brought to the forefront and never provided with support or assistance to recover and move forward with their lives. And so what we know about sport trafficking and the cases that we're able to identify are a byproduct of where people have looked for sport trafficking. And so it's really critical, and I think I see this report as a really important foundational first step in this effort to look more closely at the issue of sport trafficking, to understand how this problem is really manifesting, and to therefore translate our intervention and response efforts to align with the scale of the problem and to meet people where they are. Monique has given a fantastic grounding in the working definition of sport trafficking that we use in the report and formulate through the report, so I'm going to move past that. I wanted to settle in on these three subsets of sport trafficking that Monique identified, not to reiterate what Monique has already introduced, but to highlight that these three subsets are the way that we organise our typology of sport trafficking, organised around this idea of trafficking in sport, where exploitation takes place within the context of sport, exploitation through sport, where sport is used as a mechanism by which young aspiring athletes and athletes are drawn into exploitative cycles, and trafficking around sports, which is takes many forms, but all happens in conjunction with sporting events or industries of some kind. And that translates into a typology of 12 different forms of sport trafficking articulated in the report. And just to note structurally then how these are organised, to recognise first that it's important to understand which actors are involved in sport trafficking. And so we think about, of course, athletes and aspiring athletes as being those most centrally involved in sport trafficking cases. We think about the intermediaries and the agents that act as go-betweens between athletes and sports organisations themselves, but also then the families and communities of athletes and aspiring athletes and those outside actors that may be involved in sport trafficking cases. And we also define our typology according to two core dimensions of sport trafficking. The first being the context in which the exploitation takes place, and in that case it's the question of whether it occurs within sports, through sports, or around sports. The second being the identities of the perpetrators, whether the trafficking is perpetrated by the intermediaries and the agents, the sports organisations, outside actors, or even potentially people's own families. And we also consider other features of sport trafficking that may vary widely from case to case. That includes the level of organisation, that is the degree to which different actors in a trafficking scenario are coordinated, as well as the extent and level of structure of networks involved. While we see many cases that involve transnational criminal networks, we also see many cases in which such networks aren't at play, and we see more personalised one-on-one dynamics between aspiring athletes and their traffickers. And it's important we don't overlook those cases because we're hyperfixated on transnational criminal organisations. We think about the different methods of control that are used, the coercive means used to establish, develop, or maintain a situation of sport trafficking. Of course, we see different exploitation types, and sometimes exploitation types existed in tandem or evolving from one exploitation type to another in a single person's experience, and also the dynamics of movement and migration, as well as additional violations that might occur alongside the trafficking situation. And so that translates into 5 core types of trafficking that may occur within sports, 4 core types of trafficking occurring through sports, and 3 core types of trafficking occurring around sports. And these are detailed in the report, so I won't go into them in close detail now, but we can also discuss them further if people would like. The first type being trafficking by an exploitative sport organization. So we're thinking about situations of direct recruitment of an athlete or aspiring athlete by a sports organization that either intends to be exploitative from the outset or becomes exploitative as the situation progresses. Then we have trafficking by exploitative intermediaries for non-exploitative sports organizations. So in this situation, the sports organization itself is not involved in exploitation of the athlete, but the intermediary or agent is, and thus the athlete experiences trafficking even without an exploitative sports organization. Likewise, we can have a situation where the intermediary does not have an intent to exploit the athlete and believes that they're channeling an aspiring athlete into a legitimate sports opportunity, but then that athlete experiences exploitation by the sports entity. And then, of course, we can also have situations in which both intermediaries and agents and sports organizations both have the intent that athletes are going to be exploited. Finally, within sport, it's important to understand that families can play an important role in channeling young athletes, especially into exploitative situations. It is important to note that just sending your child to a sports camp or a sports opportunity doesn't necessarily constitute trafficking, but that the family plays a critical role in those situations. And in some situations, families are either complicit or directly involved in the trafficking of young athletes. And then we move forward to thinking about trafficking through sports. In this context, we're most commonly thinking about fraudulent agents that present young aspiring athletes with sports opportunities, often abroad, that never actually existed, and they use the promise of those sports opportunities to lure often young athletes, but more often vulnerable athletes as well, into situations of exploitation. So that, of course, includes situations where fraudulent agents are responsible for recruiting those people. That's the most common of these situations that we've seen emerge from the research to date. The exploitation in that context might be directly perpetrated by the fraudulent agent. They may be recruiting an athlete for the purpose of exploiting them themselves, but they may also place them at the hands of outside actors, at which point both the intermediary and an outside actor may be considered to be traffickers, depending on the level of knowledge of the fraudulent agent. But if they're defrauding, they're most likely to also be in a trafficking situation. Finally, also noting that after an athlete has access to sporting opportunity that actually exists, so often moving internationally, that they might then go on to be exploited by actors outside of that sporting context. Often that is a result of an unsuccessful sporting career, typically in a foreign country, and where it's not easy for that athlete to return home or to find work opportunities in the country in which they find themselves, at which point they can become vulnerable to exploitation. And again, families may also be complicit or involved in trafficking through sports, and the level of knowledge that the family has here is important in classifying the situation as one of family trafficking. Lastly, to note our 3 kinds of trafficking around sport, the first being trafficking for sexual exploitation in connection with sporting events. While there has been a reasonable amount of media attention on the question of whether or not mega sporting events are associated with an increase in sexual exploitation, the data and the evidence on this is sparse. So it's hard to say for sure that this is or is not associated, but it is a potential type of exploitation that particularly needs to be examined more thoroughly. There's also, of course, labour trafficking occurring in connection with sports and sporting events. This may be seen in the use of subcontractors engaged in organising or running sporting events, including, for instance, cleaning venues or operating concessions. And finally, the issue of sports supply chains. And as supply chains become a critical issue for anti-trafficking governance globally, it's important to acknowledge that sports organisations also have a responsibility and in some cases a legal duty, depending on the jurisdictions in which they operate, to ensure that their supply chains are clean of forced labour, modern slavery and human trafficking. These different types of exploitation and trafficking are evidenced in the 7 case studies that are examined in the Global Thematic Report. The case studies cover different types of sports, different geographies and locations, both in terms of where athletes may have been exploited and the origin contexts from which they come. In some cases, there are situations of transnational trafficking involving movement across international borders, and in other cases, they involve domestic movement. Cases of sport trafficking are multifaceted and complex and may occur in many different ways. So these 7 case studies that are presented in the report are really just an insight into some situations and some of the ways in which sport trafficking manifests, and they provide indicative examples of how the different acts, purposes, and means set out in the trafficking definition can manifest in the real world, but it's important not to take them as the final say on all possible situations of sport trafficking, because in fact many different situations may manifest. The last thing I want to do is just draw everyone's attention to the critical work of the Interpretive Guide for Sport Trafficking that's included in the Global Thematic Report. And one thing Kevin highlighted in his remarks was the importance of situating our understanding of sport trafficking within the existing legal frameworks of international law and domestic law in many states. And the implication of this is not that we create new laws, but that we better understand how existing anti-trafficking laws apply to situations of sport trafficking and how they can be better leveraged to respond to and address situations of sport trafficking when and where they occur. The guide is intended to be used by many different stakeholders, including national policymakers, investigators, prosecutors, judges and magistrates, service providers, and of course sports organisations themselves as they formulate new action and new interventions to better tackle the problem of sport trafficking. And the guide is broken into 3 substantive parts. The first, really comprehensively addressing the relevant legal frameworks for combating trafficking in persons, within which our response to sport trafficking can be situated. So we understand not only the international legal frameworks, but also the various regional legal frameworks operating in different areas of the world that can be leveraged to combat sport trafficking. And just to note, one interesting feature of this, there is one country in the world, as far as we know, that specifically includes harmful sports in its domestic legal definition of trafficking. That is interesting for folks and especially legislators to consider, and that's, in this case, the country of Rwanda, that has included harmful sports in the exploitative purposes in its domestic trafficking provisions. And then we also work through systematically the elements of the definition of trafficking in persons, dealing with each constituent act, means, and purpose to explain how it applies and how it might manifest in the context of sport trafficking. And that's critical for those that might need to identify cases of sport trafficking, that might need to investigate cases, and who are responsible for applying the law and providing support and protection. And finally, cover off next steps and recommendations. Important, of course, to note that while movement is often understood to be a central element of trafficking in persons, it is not, in fact, definitionally required in the legal definition. And just to draw everyone's attention back to the structure then, each act, means, and purpose that is addressed in the trafficking definition is explained in the interpretive guide. And because of time, I won't go into each of these. Suffice to say then, the guide may be engaged for multiple different purposes and to improve anti-trafficking action everywhere in the world. And I'll stop there, Lorena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz, for that analysis of the various forms of sport trafficking that bring this issue into sharper focus. We could move directly to the panel discussion. So Kevin, if you're good to move forward, then over to you.
Thank you, Lorena, and really thank you for the presentations we've heard, which have been really enlightening. And we've got a fairly large panel now for discussion with John Michael, who we've heard from, Dr. Alawi, who we've heard from, Dr. Monique, Dr. Katrina, and we're also joined by the Honourable Jared Okilo and Miss Marie-Laurie Lemino from FIFA. So really in this panel discussion, what we want to do is encourage the panel to discuss the report's implementation and implications and its utility, how practically they can be implemented, the cross-sector collaboration that needs to be brought out there, who else do we need to be involved, and future research that we can do. So I would like to start with Miss Marie-Laurie, if I could. Obviously, you're in a very big organization. Obviously, you know, FIFA is known by many. It's got the biggest sporting event. So if I could refer to you, and also, you know, things that FIFA has been in the media about when we look at the World Cup and the risks around building new stadia, etc. So if I could hand over to you now to give your around the practical issues of this this phenomenon.
Thank you very much. I actually built my presentation from a slightly different angle, thinking or you know, thinking that it would be a standalone presentation and not part of a discussion panel. But I think that what I detailed on the slides somehow respond to some of the questions that you just asked. So if you allow me to go through it, and then
lovely, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I might add a few things around mega sporting events that are not necessarily.
And then maybe the other panelists can actually come back to you and open the discussion with you as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You.
Yeah.
So the first thing which I think is important is that to understand, and I hope that, and I would think that all of us here and our participants understand that crime happens in and out of sports, and that, you know, unfortunately, sport is not immune from the ills of society, as we've heard from the previous speakers. And it is very well stated in the report that I would add, like any other sector, you know, sports attracts criminals to abuse and exploit women, children, athletes in, through, and around sports. What is important, I think, from my perspective, is that we need, as a sector, we need to accept that, and we need, as sports actors, we need to accept that we have a collective responsibility to put in place processes to lower the risks of all forms of violence happening, including trafficking, and we also have the responsibility to develop the regulatory ability to sanction the behaviors, those criminal behaviors when they do happen. This is why I think reports such like these global reports is very important, because it's helping us understand. And we heard the previous speakers understand the context, the typology, the human specificities of trafficking in sports, as mentioned in the executive summary. Since I have only 10 minutes, what I figured, and I had agreed with Professor Vete and Lorena, is that I wanted to share with you 10 lessons learned, one per minute, from my safeguarding practice and my role within FIFA as a football governing body, and hoping that those lessons learned can contribute to somehow the conversation we're having right now. I need to change the slide. So number one, which is sort of seems to be quite logical, is that we must work from within the system or the sports industry, sports sector, with the actors of the ecosystem to create a systemic and sustainable change. In other words, I often say with my colleagues in our department that coaches, and that we learned that coaches only listen to coaches, to say it in simple words. Those of us who belong to the sports industry, we understand how to formulate issues and to whom, when to speak up or where to put pressure. We also know where the avenues to create requirements, what to say when we speak to leadership, to the leadership of sports organization, how to convince them that they have a duty of care. So within the sports ecosystem, there are actors like yourself, like all of you here, not necessarily sports organizations, but other actors who are contributing. And like Mission 89, like us in our social responsibility division, we are 3 departments: human rights, sustainable and environmental department, and the safeguarding department. And we are trying to make a difference from the inside. And I am convinced that sports actors are best placed to understand their own ecosystem. And when I do use the word actors, I use it in a very wide manner. For me, it does include the most critical actors, because I don't think we should shy away from those who are criticizing us. This is, healthy to be pushed and to hear those criticism. It's good for us because we become better at doing, what we aim at doing. So, and this includes specialized sport media, sports, union, trade union, not trade union, sports unions, like FIFPro, the players' union. Lesson learned number 3 is, my apologies, number 2 is that this is also something that is has become very clear to me over the last 4 years since I joined FIFA, is that we need to understand how the sports ecosystem, our own discipline, is working. And there is a specific reason why I'm saying that is because, again, it sounds like an obvious and statement. And this is valid for all sports disciplines, not only football. We all, across sports disciplines, we have common features. There is a lot of overlap, but understanding the nuances and the specificities of each discipline is how it's governed, is going to help us understand how to, design better strategies to tackle the issues at stake. I mean, in our case, very specific case, we're talking here about trafficking of players. And knowing, and we heard a lot about football academies, and I fully agree and concur with what has been said, knowing how football academies are organized at country level, sometimes at regional level, how talent detection is organized, where aspiring elite players are training, how they are recruited, understanding their legal context, understanding the mechanics of transfer of players, knowing how football agent operates legally and illegally, will help all of us, not only us as an international federation and the football governing body, but all of us in defining strategy to combat criminal behavior in, through, and around sports.
Could I just interject there, Marie-Laure? Because it's really good, important, and I want to get this into a discussion format. But at that point, could I ask John Michael, it's sometimes since your exploitation, and obviously have things moved on, have things changed, have lessons been learned, do you feel, or do you think there's still a lot to be done?
I think there's a lot to be done. excuse me, I think there are sports that are totally in denial that things are happening within them. And I'll point out figure skating is one of them that truly denies the fact that they have any issues. I think that we have to take a moment and realize that this is happening in every sport. Anytime that there's a chance of power and misuse of that power can lead to a possibility of an abusive situation. And I do see in certain sports, things are getting a lot better. I also think that there's still too many sports that are totally in denial again, just like what I said.
Yeah. And could I just ask Dr. Alawali, the former ambassador from Nigeria? I've been to Nigeria a number of times and in southern Italy, and that's a country, and I'll come next to the national representative of Kenya, that young boys from Africa are very much lured into promises, into football in particularly. Is that something that you see in your countries? I mean, Dr. Alawali, do you see that in Egypt? And are there efforts being made by the industry to counter recruitment if it is something that's there?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Look, it's a dream of every young, and I can speak not just for Nigeria.
When we saw that technical problem, could I come to the Honourable Jared Okello from Kenya? What's your experience on this with sport? Obviously, you have a lot of talent, particularly, if we look at, the Kenyans excel in the Olympics, for example, and field sports. Have you experienced that in your country? And do you get any help from the agencies and the bodies that are in charge of these sports issues?
Well, thank you very much, my brother John. And from the outset, my name is Jared Okello, a member of parliament here in Kenya, serving my second term. And allow me to thank Lerina and the team for the dedication to end the vice. The testimony by John Michael was very moving, a moving testimony that we have very cunning recruiters all over the world. It is perplexing how young kids are vulnerable, and the contribution by our culture to fester the ill that men don't report, even if it touches on their welfare. So Mission 89 has actually removed the veil on the ugly face of trafficking through sports, which was for a long time a very silent, smooth, illegal endeavor. Here in Kenya, and I have worked very closely with Lerina, organizing sporting events to create awareness and come up with deterrent measures, some of which have ended up in Parliament to tighten legislation. What we have done on the side of legislation is firstly to create very heavy penalties in areas where people have been identified to be carrying out this illegal act. Our constitution now, together with enabling acts of Parliament, makes it an illegality to engage in this vice, and it attracts a penalty of 20 million Kenya shillings. 20 million Kenya shillings would be an equivalent of about 20,000 US dollars. And not 20,000, but 200,000 US dollars. So that is how heavy it is. And it also attracts 10 years in prison, or both. So in certain cases, you end up paying the penalty, but still serving your 10-year jail. So these are deterrent measures that I hope the whole world would adopt, so that you don't make it, easy for anyone engaging in this vice. We have been told how it's a multi-trillion enterprise. So if you make it easy, they will pay and walk away and carry out with the same vice. So laws must be tightened in a manner that prevents people from engaging in this. Another thing that we have done is to come up with laws that also defend those who have been victims. to enable them to come out to speak. Because if you only penalize them, then no one will come out to tell you. In this particular vice, the problem that we have is the irregular patterns or pathways. So they will be moving from one particular method to another method. And in order to curb this vice, you have to give remedies to those who have fallen victims. So you create an enabling environment, firstly, to share their experiences and provide remedial measures towards punishing them. And that has really helped, people come forward to be able to speak. And, the government provides legal, counseling, and psychological support to trafficked survivors. Because you listen to my brother, John Michael, for example, definitely one would need a psychological, counseling out of the experiences that come as a result of being trafficked. So these have also been infused in our law to enable such things to happen. So we have laws that protect, people who have been trafficked, and we also have very tightened controls, preferring heavy penalties to those who engage in this vice. Kevin.
Yeah, I think, I commend you that Kenya's taking steps legally as well. But I was wondering, and I hope this is something Lorena would be very much interested, is we're all very excited about the G20 being in Africa this year. Obviously, it will be held in South Africa, but of course the African Union is now a member. And the discussion topics and the priorities, I think that there is a big space for this to be entered into the discussions of the G20, because it fits, world sports fit onto the global stage. Often the G20 countries are the best countries at performing in those events, not solely, but they do well in those events, in some of them. But I think also, to bring this up at, your regional G20 event that's going to be this year, I think would be something really positive. Do you think that would be a good place to, highlight this excellent work and the way that Kenya, for example, is combating this? You're on mute, sir.
Yes, I think that's an excellent platform, and indeed we have a very comprehensive dissemination strategy for this report. The G20 summit wasn't included in that, but it will definitely go on there, and perhaps with the support of Honorable Okello, we can make sure that we're present.
Sure. Something else I wanted to look at is future research directions. And of course, we've heard from Nottingham Rights Lab, which is excelling in research on this agenda. But briefly, could you tell us and the other academic on the panel, between you, where do you think this should go? What do you think should happen? And of course, one coming from South Africa, maybe feeding into the G20 would be something as well. But where do you two think that this should go? And obviously, whilst we've got, say, somebody from FIFA, where would you like to see future research go?
Monique, did you want to jump on this one first?
If you want to. Okay, so obviously we're coming from slightly different perspectives, Katerina and I. So I think it's so important that when we start talking about sport trafficking, that we actually really get to grips with the phenomenon itself. It's, we've taken a very important first step, but there's so much more that we really need to unravel in the different sports industries themselves, and understanding how this actually plays out and what the factors are there in particular. Because what becomes so important, and thank you so much again to John Michael and his testimony, one of the most important things that we need to understand is that sports trafficking cannot be divorced from the spectrum of abuse and exploitation that exists within the sporting world itself. We always need to look at, many of the enabling factors that actually, and what's creating that. And it's the silence that exists really around sports itself. And actually looking at how athlete abuse is higher than any other population, if we're looking particularly at minors. So what is creating those vulnerabilities there to that abuse and exploitation? And that is because it's such a closed system that we're looking at, and it's often opaque from the outside there. So we need more empirical data collection. We need to start looking at where are the hotspots in terms of sport trafficking, which sporting codes, which countries, for example, is it more domestic, is it more transnational? What are we looking at in terms of those features there as well? We also need some more longitudinal studies, how it's evolved over time, because we're really starting just to barely scratch the surface, but also victims' post-trafficking experiences, because particularly if we're looking at trafficking through sport, victims are often, if they are abandoned, for example, they're actually susceptible to further abuse and exploitation and offering trafficking cases or even criminality. We also need to actually map out what happens to many victims after their trafficking experiences as well. And I think we really need to also look, like I mentioned, the various different types of sports. We know the more visible ones, like football, for example, because it is so visible, like we see with other forms of human trafficking as well. We know a lot more often what's happening in the sex industry, for example, than what is happening elsewhere in different forms of labor trafficking or the like, or like with us with sport trafficking, because it is not as visible and well known to the public eye. So different forms of sport we need to look at. We need to look really more into unregulated academies, for example, fake scouting programs, also looking at the various gender dimensions as well, as more female athletes are also competing as well. And also for me, quite importantly, I think we need to also start focusing on illicit financial flows that actually support sport trafficking and the role of networks that enable trafficking. And I'll just pass it on to Katerina now.
Katerina, could I just ask you as well to comment, perhaps a little bit localized to the UK, but not just unique to the UK, is, for example, those who are not from the UK or don't know the UK that well. This week is what's called Cheltenham Gold Cup. It's one of the biggest sports events in the world, where some of the best horses come to compete around national hunt riding, so over the fences. And it's the attendance for the 4 days it's on is enormous. It's somewhere in the region of about 750,000 people. But there is known, and I knew this when I was a police officer, an increased demand for prostitution and sexual exploitation, and people coming from all over the world bringing women. So there are areas of sports that we don't hear about much, where there's exploitation. So, I mean, just considering the many areas of sport, do you think that we really cover all the areas that need to be looked at and the kind of opportunities this creates? You mentioned this being a crime.
Yeah, I think Monique's hit the hammer on nail on the head here, and you've spoken to it as well. We just don't have the quality of robust and systematic data across the sports industries and across different sports that we really need to properly understand this problem. So improving the quality of data and evidence and making it more systematic is a really critical priority in this space to properly understand the scale and the dynamics of the problem everywhere that it manifests, and not just in those cases that happen to make it to light for various reasons. And I think there's space here, and it's wonderful that Maria's here with us, for sports organizations to be some of those key actors that are supporting serious investigations and serious research into the modern slavery human trafficking risks, connected to the events that they're hosting, connected to their sports academies, connected to their supply chains, to really tackle this challenge. And I think the other area of research that we really need to see more work done is actually what works to tackle this problem. We saw a question in the chat about what is an effective intervention in this context, and we don't actually have robust evaluation evidence on what actually works to tackle these problems. So we also need research and evidence at the other end of the spectrum, that what makes an effective response? What is an effective way to help identify and support those people experiencing sport trafficking into recovery? What is an effective way to build resilience in vulnerable communities so that they don't fall prey to these exploitative actors? And that's really also an area for much more focused future research in this space.
Can I jump in here?
And apologise that firstly I was going to ask, could you share your presentation so it can be shared with delegates? But I'd like to give the last few minutes to you so you can actually reflect on what you've heard and come back with your points as a major element of sporting industry.
Just to react to the last point about research needs, future research. I mean, of course, I fully agree, and what we're doing from the perspective of a football governing body is monitoring the research trends, becoming familiar with the findings of the main reports, just like this one and others, and then try to produce, strategies and to come up with, to adapt our strategy, at least from our department, the perspective of our department, and convincing our leadership that we need to explore and continue our efforts and invest in addressing, other types of problem. And the topic of academies over the last 2 years has become for our department a priority topic because of that, because internally, we heard other departments and divisions on the technical side of the house, those who are in charge of global football development, they started talking about talent detection, about developing academies with the FIFA label. And of course, from our safeguarding perspective, we saw all the red flags when we heard that speech internally, and we contacted our colleagues who are experts in the technical aspect of footballs, and engage in discussions with them to let them know that they needed to embed in their own operations requirements to prevent violence in when they in their plans to develop football academies across the world, with incredible figures in terms of sort of opening up year after year more and more academies. And at the same time, we developed, we are about to publish in a few months what we call well-being and safeguarding guidelines in football academies. And these will be made available to our members at country level. And for the first time, they will have a practical tool with specific requirements, all of the aspects they need to look at to embed, to have it deployed in the operations of the academy that they control. Because here we heard about academies, but we all know that there are different systems. Academies are all, some of them are run as private businesses, and they're not under the remit or the jurisdiction of, let's say, the official football, organized football at country level. And FIFA has no say in that, because really the laws that are applicable in a private business academy are the laws of the country. And of course, if there are strong laws and criminal laws, sports laws, etc., those private businesses, as any other business, are subject to those laws, and it's for the sports authorities to oversee that, I would say. Going back to the slide that you can see on the screen, and again, thinking of the governance model and all of the things that you've been saying, I see the governance model of football as an onion with multiple layers. And you see that we are an international federation, we are a governing body, but then you have sub-regional zonal association, you have CAF, the confederation in Africa, AFC, etc., CONCACAF, CONMEBOL. Then you have country level member associations, football associations. And then within big federal countries, you have state level organizations and sub-state level organizations. So what we heard from different actors and examples of good practice of initiatives and positive projects, that all of us here, this embedded in this sort of governance modeling at different levels, we have a role to play. And all of these actors at different levels, international, regional, sub-regional, local, etc., state level, we are bound by a regulatory framework, and we have our own scope. So one thing I've learned is sometimes that there is an expectation that because FIFA is an international federation and the football governing body, that the expectation is that we fix all the problems of football, and especially, let's say from my perspective, the violence and all the criminal activity in football. And I think of this as a very naive perspective, because just like any other organization, we are bound by governing rules. We have disciplinary and ethics codes. We have judicial bodies. We have plenty of rules, and we have to follow those rules. And it's good that we have to follow those rules. That means we have, a certain power, but with limits. And then we are a membership-based organization, which is also very important. So there are ways where we can embed some requirements, for example, in funding streams for our member associations. Let's say there is a funding stream to open a FIFA academy, a FIFA certified academy. Then there are 4 or 5 safeguarding requirements among, a large list of 55 requirements, technical ones. We were successful in embedding 4 safeguarding requirements, forcing the member associations, if they want to get funding to open a FIFA academy, to have a safeguarding officer appointed, to have a safeguarding policy, to run a background check on all the staff that will be operating in the ecosystem of the academy. Those are the requirements that we were able to embed, negotiating with our colleagues who are running the FIFA Academy project, and embedded as a funding requirement. And I know that we heard before that there is a lot that needs to be done, that remains to be done, and it is very true. I think in our line of business, it's never enough.
Yeah. I have to interject there, Marie-Lou, because we're running out of time. I'm just going to say we have got questions in the Q&A. Some have been answered by our panel on the Q&As, but one thing that's been mentioned, and maybe in the summing up, I'm going to hand back over to Lorena. One of the things that has been mentioned, Lorena, is about prevention and about other areas. We have heard about other areas of trafficking. One area was talked about there was cricket, for example. But one thing that keeps coming up is several of the questions are about prevention. And thank you, others on the panel have answered some of the questions. So I'd like to hand back to you now, Lorena. Thank you very much for all the panelists. Sorry,
Kevin, please, I'm sorry, Kelvin. Before you hand over to Lorena, can I just ask Marie-Lou again? Sometimes, and I'm glad she's working on safeguards, and the safeguard, particularly in football, has to do with kids. And when you go back to the issue of the academy, it's easier to say yes, there are private. Sometimes one is taken aback when it's convenient for FIFA to say, no, we are not this. But we also know that where they are determined to do more on safeguard, you know that members association, kids that are under 8, 10, 12, are often not on the register of national football associations. And so you will not have any control over their international transfers. And here we are talking, nor can you regulate even what goes on in those academies, the overworking conditions, how these kids are subjected to long hours and all those things. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in safeguarding within the academies, wherever they are located. And also how football clubs, especially in Europe, will be prohibited from funding, whether indirectly, the ones that are not even, that the so-called private ones, because you have so many of the clubs funding them through third parties. So it's easy to say, well, FIFA cannot be all this, but we should not wait for some active, governments to go after FIFA before some of these safeguard rules, particularly where it involves the kids, and they are the ones engaged in this. We know the efforts that have been made. You cannot give them contract. But they are not also listed on the register of FA. So you don't even know when they are being transferred. and then the exploitation continues. I would like to see the presentation and to continue to look into this brilliant.
Yeah, I think your points are very valid, and this what Mission 89 is doing is part of a process, and this is what it's trying to address. And I think one of the things that we heard from Katerina is understanding this is a crime, and if you identifying it, remember it's a crime, and the people that are doing this are criminals, and we need to address it in that way. But we are running out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Lorena now. Thank you very much to all the panel. I'm afraid we ran out of time, but there was a lot to discuss, so I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And there always is so much to discuss, and everyone that's been and attended our events, it's the same drill. There's just never enough time to discuss, but perhaps if Ambassador Voiti, Michelle, you give us the opportunity, we may come back another time where we focus entirely on the panel, and we just have a panel discussion now that the report has been fully presented. I would want to make a comment on the questions, the recurring questions around prevention mechanisms or prevention systems. And, this global thematic report is that first line, because, knowledge is, I would say knowledge is the first line of protection. Knowledge is the first line of prevention. And here we have worked very hard to put together a report that's not only founded on, on research, but we always said that we wanted to produce a practical tool. And in this report, we have the typologies. We also have the interpretive guide. And so these are practical tools that would, support the efforts of all the different stakeholders and key actors. And so I encourage everybody that is online, with us today to download the full report. It's on the Mission 89 website, but it's also on the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Loughborough, Loughborough University website as well. And we didn't get a chance to, for Olawale Ambassador to go through the recommendations, but there in itself, they're very practical and tangible suggestions and again, tools that can support, your efforts. So thank you, everyone. I thank you to the speakers. Thank you, Kevin, for moderating so excellently that last, the panel session. And if I may, at this point, pass on to Michelle to just give because it is your platform. So I think it's only right that you have the last word or the final word. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorena. At the end of this highly informative and meaningful webinar, I would like to thank all speakers, and especially Lorena Bright, once again for the value of the very important work of Mission 89 and the exceptional quality of the global thematic report on trafficking in sport. As Lorena said, the report is freely available online, and I also strongly encourage all people who did not do that to read it. As we conclude this webinar, I would like to thank Yves Reichenbach, Emanuele Piluso, and Cesare Lombardo for their contributions. In a few days, a video recording of this webinar and of the 45 webinars we have organized with subtitles in 7 languages will be available on our websites, on Vimeo, and on YouTube. We hope it will help to further the analysis of human trafficking in sports. And in the coming weeks, we will be organizing events with international organizations at the UN in Geneva. And actually, we would like to invite all interested parties to our next UN event. You can participate in person or online. And this event will take place at the UN in Geneva on Friday, the 20th of March from 12 noon to 1 in room 22 of the Palais des Nations. And the main objective of this event, and Kevin Highland will be also participating in this event, is to raise awareness of the need for comprehensive training and capacity building initiatives to effectively combat human trafficking. We organize this event with UNITAR, and we provide a platform for policymakers, diplomats, law enforcement officials, and civil society actors to exchange ideas and best practices while highlighting the importance of education and training in preventing and combating human trafficking. And this an online course, that's my last word, an online course on human trafficking will be jointly organized by the Order of Malta and UNITAR in January, February 2026. Interesting persons can already pre-register. Thank you for joining us and best wishes to all. Thank you.